I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor.
I have one objective today in our episode of Women's Health Unplugged, and I'm going to make you care about your iron status. I had to do some research for the Confident Clinician, which is my online clinician group where, we move through evidence-based information every month and provide clinicians with the practice support that they need to support their patients in the best way possible. And this month, we looked specifically at the use of interventions like nutraceuticals, fish oil, nutrients, supplements for anxiety and depression. And that was a project that was taken on by my students at McMaster University. So I actually teach at McMaster University. I developed a couple of courses for them when I graduated on developing research skills in undergraduate students on evidence-based integrative medicine and nutrition. It's not something that's typically focused on in either an undergrad setting or in medical school. And because most of the health science students go off to some sort of professional placement in healthcare, I felt like there was a really strong need to have an early intervention for future medical doctors to be able to help them be able to read literature on nutrition and on supplements, because it's really not the same as reading literature on drugs. It's just not. So even though we maybe hold the research studies on medications as being the very best way to run a research study, that doesn't always apply when we're talking about nutrition or when we're talking about supplements. And so I developed these courses for McMaster to help them teach their undergraduate students how to read literature. And this year, my students did a term-long project on the use of nutraceuticals and nutrients for the treatment of anxiety and depression. And they actually presented to my clinician group, which is a cool experience for my students to present to my 400 naturopathic doctors that are in my program. Now, the reason I'm giving you all of this preamble is because this is what's kind of led up to today's podcast topic. So I basically assigned my students what I wanted them to focus on because it was something that I thought we needed to do a bit of a deep dive on. Mental health is something that can be quite topical for university students. They've either had an experience themselves or have had a close contact with someone who struggled with mental health. So we spent a long time talking about how we need to approach those patients with that more biopsychosocial model of healthcare. We talked about the failures of conventional support for patients with mental health. Anyways, I sicked them on this topic and I was like, I want you to study iron and the impact of mental health. And they looked at all sorts of nutrients, but iron was one of them. And I had these incredibly grand expectations of what they were going to come back with. And I was sorely disappointed that at the end of the 12 weeks of them working on this topic, they didn't find what I thought they were going to find with respect to iron. As they were giving their presentation, I sat there with bated breath, couldn't wait to get to the iron part. And they basically found almost zero studies looking at using iron to support mental health. And in their opinion, they couldn't really make a strong recommendation around using iron to support mental health. And I was disappointed. So I decided that I was going to look into it because I couldn't figure out why there was such a correlation between the symptoms of anxiety and depression and iron deficiency and anemia, and why we didn't have the research to back it up that actually using iron for treating those things would be helpful. So I spent time on it. And after going through the literature myself and then presenting it to my clinician group, I felt like this was a really relevant conversation for us to have at large because there is this missing piece of information, or there is a gap between what we know about the role of iron in the body what we know about the level of just deficiency in people walking around, and then the lack of research using iron to support the way that people feel. So we'll walk through it. So if I just lost you there, don't worry, we will go through that. But what I want you to leave this episode with is one, having questions about your own iron status. So even if you've never been told you have low iron before, I am going to highly encourage you to get tested with your practitioner, and I'm going to give you some of those tests of what you're going to look for. We're going to talk about the stages of iron deficiency and why it may not have shown up in your health yet, even though it may still be an underlying problem. And then we're going to talk about that gap, like why, from like research to practice, why do we see such a disconnect? So essentially that term iron deficiency really is just implying that your intake of iron, your absorption of iron, which sometimes those are two different things, are not meeting your daily needs or the daily demand of what it takes for your body to run properly. Now, iron does lots of things, but maybe the most important thing that it does in the body is regulate red blood cell production. And so the challenge that we've had historically is that we're looking for what we would call iron deficiency anemia, which is where your hemoglobin levels will start to drop below a threshold that we've set based on your age and life stage. So in pregnancy, it may be different than at other times in your life, if you're male or female, or if you're a child. We have targets for what that hemoglobin level is. And hemoglobin is in red blood cells. It carries oxygen in the blood. And so what we've typically looked for, defined as being this breaking point for looking specifically at iron, is if patients were showing with iron deficiency anemia. Now, that actual definition is that you don't have enough iron to make the red blood cells that are necessary for you to run your body properly. And so the first question you should really be asking yourself or asking your practitioner is that the first time we'd like to acknowledge that iron levels are not ideal? And the answer that we're finding in the research is no, not surprisingly. So we shouldn't wait for people to have a hemoglobin that falls below this threshold that's like, oh shit, your iron's so low that you now don't have enough oxygen in your blood, that there's actually quite a range between that moment and where iron levels are actually below what is ideal for your health and wellness, and I'm going to include in that mental health. So non-anemic, meaning your hemoglobin levels are fine, non-anemic iron deficiency is a thing. It's a step between being iron replete and totally fine and iron deficient and not having enough hemoglobin. There is a period of time in between those two where patients may still present with symptoms. And so interestingly, when I started to look at specifically where our current reference ranges lie, where we start to see symptoms show up in patients, and how we should interpret their lab work, there's quite a gap between what I see done in clinical practice, what we see in some of the recommendations being made by major health organizations. So in Canada right now, we test serum ferritin in most patients, I would say. And I would say that's probably true in the United States as well. Ferritin it's in your blood, so it's in your serum, and it is a reflection of your iron storage. So ferritin is actually an intracellular thing, so there's some in your blood and in your serum, but there's actually ferritin in all of your cells, and it stores iron. So it hangs on to the iron that's in all of your cells. If you've ever heard about iron being bad or iron causing inflammation or oxidative stress, we have ferritin in our body to hang on to iron so that we only use it where we need it, and it doesn't cause oxidative stress in our cells. That's the purpose of ferritin. It basically hangs on to our iron. But we have iron in our blood as well as in our cells, and the iron in our blood can be kind of a reflection of where our iron storage levels are at. So if our iron storage goes down in our cells, then that serum ferritin level will start to decrease. And if our iron levels are replete, then that level will sit in kind of a good reference range or an appropriate reference range. Now in Canada, and this is changing slowly, but most laboratory reference ranges will set the lower limit of ferritin somewhere around 5, maybe 10. I've seen 15. And interestingly, the World Health Organization and many other global organizations that look specifically at iron, because iron is actually the number one nutritional deficiency globally, is they're actually suggesting that any ferritin level below 15 for sure is iron deficient, but many texts and many organizations are also now starting to say that anything below 30 would qualify as being maybe non-anemic, so maybe your hemoglobin is fine, but you're iron deficient even though your red blood cells are still capable of being made. Okay, so it's that gray zone between hemoglobin is fine, but ferritin levels have dropped below 35. Now, I know personally, every single time I've ever run my ferritin, it has been below 35. And the estimates on the percentage of people that have a ferritin that actually qualifies as being iron deficient is really high. Depending on the population that we're looking at, is it 20%? There's some texts that will say 15%, there's some that will say 25%. There's a huge percentage of patients that fall in that iron's not quite good enough for you to feel optimal, but it's not quite low enough for you to have iron deficiency anemia. And I find this fascinating because of how connected iron is to the symptoms that women have that are like the majority of symptoms that people present with. So when I'm working with a patient, their number one concerns are things like energy, hair loss, exercise intolerance, sleep disturbance, anxiety, irritability, depression. And all of those symptoms fall in that iron deficient state. So if ferritin levels are below 35, the likelihood of having those symptoms is high. So if we take patients and we line them up based on their ferritin levels, if you're below 35, your likelihood of having all of those symptoms or some of those symptoms is significantly higher than if you're iron replete. And we've even flagged those symptoms as being the likely symptoms if you have iron deficiency. So if patients present with like non-specific fatigue, the thing we're supposed to do is to test their iron and to test their hemoglobin or test their ferritin and their hemoglobin. And so sometimes patients are just having their hemoglobin tested and they don't have anemia. And then well, it's not your iron. Sometimes patients are having their ferritin tested and their number comes back at 28. And then they're told that, their iron is fine because the lower level of the reference range is like 5 or 10. So you can see we've got even just this diagnostic issue where the symptoms of iron deficiency are kind of non-specific, right? There's lots of things that cause fatigue. The diagnostic criteria for iron deficiency exists, and we're really clear about it when it comes to the World Health Organization and other major organizations. Below 35, bad. And yet the reference range in the lab, right, is maybe not going to highlight or bold your ferritin of 17, which was what mine was the last time that I had it tested. I honestly should do it again. And your physician is probably going to underestimate the impact of that number because it's like not terrible, right? It's not 2. It's not terrible. And yet, when we start to look at the likelihood of having anxiety, depression, and all of those symptoms, if you fall below 35, that's really high. So I want you to care. I want you to care about your ferritin. If you're struggling with any symptoms, if you're struggling with muscle weakness or fatigue or joint pain or hair loss, I want you to think about your iron. I want you to care about your iron. And if that number comes back below 35, you need to care about it. Now, not to complicate the conversation, but there's lots of research that suggests that even if a ferritin is over 35, we're maybe still not that happy with it. One of the challenges we have with ferritin is that it has a dual purpose in the blood. So it also increases in number. Remember, ferritin is just a storage vessel for your iron. It's not a true measure of iron. It is a storage vessel for your iron. Our production of that storage vessel goes up when we have inflammation. So ferritin levels rise when we have inflammation. So if you have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or another autoimmune condition, if you have PCOS or diabetes, if you are in pregnancy and have gestational diabetes, if you have anything that raises inflammation, your ferritin level goes up. But again, this is a storage vessel. It is not a true reading of your actual iron. And so it calls into question how valuable it is to look at ferritin when patients have inflammation. And how many patients have inflammation? A lot of them. And so when you get that ferritin number back, if it's between 35 and 100, we have to ask you some follow-up questions. We maybe have to do some follow-up blood work to try and look a little bit more closely at your iron. Ferritin's a really cheap measure of iron, But there's more specific tests that can be done to help us understand, is your ferritin a true reading or is it caused by inflammation? Now, I don't mean to complicate the conversation. We're going to take a step back and go back to simpler terms. But I also wanted you to recognize that if you had ferritin of 65 on your last set of blood work, but you can't answer the question, or if I ask you the question, do you think you're inflamed? And you say yes, that 65 is still maybe too low for you. Okay, so I'm not trying to teach you here how to interpret your blood work. I'm trying to teach you here how to know when to advocate for testing and for maybe additional testing, or for us to still stay curious about your iron, even if your lab work looks kind of normal-ish. There's lots of suggestions that even if ferritin is under 100 and we think patients have iron deficiency, we should probably treat them that way. Because ferritin can fluctuate so much and can fluctuate in response to infection and inflammation, we probably can't rule out iron deficiency until your ferritin is over 100, which is fascinating because think about me walking around with a 17 and on paper, it's not highlighted by the lab, it's not bold, and yet we can't really rule out iron not causing some symptoms until it gets over 100. So here's where things get weird. Our understanding of what happens when someone is iron deficient to their health, specifically their mental health, is really significant. We actually know that changes to the brain as a consequence of iron deficiency happen even in utero and in early neonatal period, or when patients have just been born. If patients are born to iron deficient mothers, if patients are iron deficient themselves in that neonatal period, we see changes to the mental health and to the health status of that person, the moment they're born. So we know that iron is incredibly concentrated in certain areas of the brain, and when that doesn't happen because of iron deficiency, infants actually are more agitated. They display more irritability and more fearfulness. So we can actually see unhappiness, wariness during infancy and also during early toddler years in young patients who have iron deficiency. So we'll see things the young patient is afraid to leave their mother, and so they will play in close proximity to their parent or guardian if they have iron deficiency versus feeling confident kind of moving out into the world. We know that infants that are born to mothers who have iron deficiency also have changes to their cognition, their memory, their focus. They have an increased likelihood of being diagnosed with ADHD. They have more cognitive changes and have a higher likelihood of being diagnosed with anxiety and depression in their 20s and 30s. So iron deficiency at a young age actually has a really significant impact on mental health in general. We also see it in adolescence. So young patients who have iron deficiency in adolescence have more difficulty in school. They have more difficulty being connected to others. They have poorer cognitive performance. They have more missed school days than patients who are iron replete. And interestingly, in animal models, if we restrict iron in sort of various times in pregnancy and neonatal life in animals, and then later give them back iron, they don't get to be the same level of cognitive function and a reduction in anxiety and depression as their peers. So the mouse who is given no iron as a baby mouse, if we, by the time they're a little bit older of a mouse, we go, okay, here's some iron, you can have some back now. They still underperform compared to their sister mouse who was given enough iron from day one. So not only does iron have a really significant developmental impact on mental health and cognitive health, if we don't have enough iron during those sensitive windows of life, then we actually may be at a permanent disadvantage from a cognitive health perspective and a mental health perspective. And I'm not saying that to be all doom and gloom. I am actually saying that to highlight the importance of what we're talking about with respect to iron and mental health. So huge connections. We know biologically iron restriction in pregnancy, neonatal life, toddlerhood, adolescence, significant impact on mental health. Now, what about adults? So, it's unethical for us to restrict food and restrict nutrients in humans, right? We can't I mean, they used to. They used to do some studies, and there's some of those starvation studies, et cetera, where we've really learned a lot about human nutrition and physiology. But we don't have a lot of studies where we intentionally take nutrients away from people to see what happens. It's just not ethical. So what ends up happening with nutrition research is we often follow large groups of people for a really long period of time and see what happens to them, right? Like see who gets what based on their nutrition patterns, based on their nutrient status. So it was actually a really large cohort study that was done in Taiwan. In this study, everyone is in the study. So 99% of people who live in Taiwan are in this cohort. And they tracked these people over a course of 13 years, specifically looking to see what happens in adulthood with respect to mental health and iron deficiency. So the cool part about the study is that they actually started with everybody at a baseline of having zero mental health symptoms. So it's not like they looked at people who had anxiety and depression through childhood, even though we've kind of already flagged that that's a really significant window of time that iron deficiency would affect someone. These are people who, in adulthood, had no symptoms of mental health. And then they checked all of their iron status and figured out who was iron deficient and who wasn't, who had anemia, who didn't. And then they followed them for 13 years to see what happened. Now, interestingly, being in the iron deficient anemia group increased their risk of having a mental health diagnosis by the end of 13 years by 52%, which was a really significant increased risk. And so that was the same for anxiety, for depression, other psychotic disorders, and even sleep disorders. So all of those things related to mental health were increased by about a magnitude of a 50% increased risk in patients who were iron deficient at the beginning of those 13 years. So they just followed them over time. And we have other examples of that where we've looked specifically at postpartum depression and anxiety with respect to iron deficiency. We've followed other cohorts of adults to know that whether you're frankly anemic, so think back to the beginning of this episode, what I said anemia was, which is where hemoglobin's low, red blood cell production is low, oxygen low, or just having low iron, right? But none of those other things happening. Either of those two things happening increases your risk of having mental health symptoms. Anxiety, depression are the ones that I've specifically focused on, but there are others. Interestingly, we don't have a lot of studies on what happens if we give these people who have depression and anxiety and low iron. We don't have studies on it. And when I sat back, so remember at the beginning, I said my McMaster students were like, nope, giving iron for mental health is not a thing. We can't find any research about it. And I was shocked. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And so I went and looked at it. And after finding that, iron deficiency causes permanent cognitive changes in people if it's done at a developmentally important window of our life, that the likelihood of having ADHD and anxiety and depression, cognitive, slow cognition, all of these symptoms that often patients present with is so much higher if you have iron deficiency or iron deficiency anemia. And yet we haven't bothered to really study what happens if we give people the iron. This is kind of this fascinating piece, is that we haven't given the iron to see what happens afterwards, to see if you get better. Now, I shouldn't say there's zero. There are a couple of studies that have started to look specifically at what happens if we give some people iron. So very small study done in 2021, and they looked at what happened if we gave kids iron who had a ferritin below 30. So remember, mine was 17. If we gave the kids iron if their ferritin was below 30, and they saw a significant improvement in anxiety, depression, fatigue, and insomnia in the young patients who were given iron deficiency, or iron, sorry, not iron deficiency. We also see some solutions specifically for postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety that if we treat her anemia, she gets better. We've also seen some studies in what happens if we stop women's heavy menstrual bleeding, specifically by giving women an IUD or a hysterectomy. And those women over time also start to present with less mental health symptoms over time. And so we're seeing whispers of yo, guys, if we treat iron deficiency, we might be able to make a patient's mental health symptoms better. But the research is not as robust as it is to give you an antidepressant. And so you imagine you go in, so you can see the picture that I'm trying to paint for you here. You go to the doctor, you're tired, you're anxious, you're depressed, and you're losing your hair. We run your lab work and you're not anemic. And we check your ferritin and it's 25. So it's not flagged. It's not bold. It's fine on paper. Yet, if you ask the World Health Organization, you have iron deficiency. We know that if ferritin levels fall below 20, we're really likely to see a worsening of mental health symptoms. If it's below 15, you're doomed. But we really see significant mental health symptoms in patients when their ferritin falls below 20. We're not really supposed to rule out iron deficiency until your ferritin's over 100, especially if you have inflammation in your body. We haven't bothered to study using iron to support your mental health symptoms, but we've studied Prozac. So what do you leave the visit with? How do you feel when you leave the visit? Right? And I am a huge fan and advocate of antidepressant medication. Huge fan. I've even used it myself for various times of my life. Huge fan. What I'm talking about, though, is underassessment. What I'm talking about is a gap in the research that has us so convinced that iron has an impact on mental health, and yet we've never bothered to try giving it to see if it improves it. It blows my mind. And that's when I was going through this research. And so the conversation I'm having with my clinician group is really about how to apply a more sensitive lens to look for iron deficiency. So how do we find it in women if some of their labs are normal? How do we find it in women if they have inflammation? What's that second set of tests that we need to do to rule out the inflammation part and get really clear about the iron deficiency part? But when I was going through that literature, I was like, you know who else needs to know this? You. You need to know this because you've had your ferritin run in the last year, I guarantee, unless you haven't been to a lab. But I guarantee if you've had blood work done in the last couple of years, someone's run your ferritin. And I'm willing to bet the farm on the fact that it's below 35. There's even some organizations, including gastrointestinal organizations, that are starting to say below 40 actually might be a more reasonable cutoff. But let's just say 35. We'll go with the World Health Organization. You're probably below 35. And if in the last 2 years you've been tired, anxious, depressed, had exercise intolerance, and what I mean by that is like you run up a flight of stairs and you say to yourself, God, I'm so out of shape. When really it's just that you can't catch up to the demand of needing the oxygen to go up the stairs because you're a little iron deficient. Maybe your hair is falling out. Maybe your nails are brittle. Maybe you have some non-specific body pain or non-restorative sleep, or maybe your sleep's disrupted completely. Maybe you have restless leg. All of these symptoms are symptoms of iron deficiency, and I want you to understand that and feel super empowered to go and deal with this with your practitioner, because it's not good enough for us to just look for lab work that's bold. It's not good enough, right? If we think about what those reference ranges are, is they just test thousands of people and look at the 95% confidence interval and kind of give you the lay of the land of what everybody has, but everybody's iron deficient in North America. And so our reference range is going to be skewed, that it's like looking at your ferritin against mine and going, yeah, they're both the same, but neither of us are well. And so I want you to go pull that lab work, have a look. I want you to talk to somebody about your iron status, especially if you're struggling with symptoms, especially if you're menstruating, okay? Because we are battling daily and monthly losses that need to be accounted for somewhere, and you probably can't fix it through your diet. I hope that was helpful. This is super kind of passionate rant that I went on. It's not very often that I read research and I'm like, this must become a podcast immediately and be released right now. Except this particular topic, I felt really compelled that it needed to be shared on a more population based level. And so I hope it was helpful. Go read your lab work, make an appointment with your practitioner. And if you need a practitioner, I know a girl.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.